Your biggest competition publicly reports their financial performance, giving you valuable used car industry economic intelligence. Are you paying attention to it? Let's talk about it in this next episode.
Welcome to Down Payment, the podcast for used car dealers. Prepare to learn something new about the industry that keeps us moving.
Check out all our podcast content on our social media channels. We are at Down Payment Podcast on YouTube, Down Payment Podcast on Instagram, and Down Payment Pod on X. Welcome back. And I want to start out this episode by first, in all transparency, saying where my loyalties lie. I am from the independent used car dealership side of the industry. My entire career was spent in the independent side of the industry. However, used car dealers do themselves a massive disservice when they don't pay attention to the success of the big used car dealerships. Competing with them hasn't exactly been a lot of fun. A number of years ago, here in our home market of Colorado, I did an internal study for our dealership that showed that we were losing market share to them pretty dramatically. In my study over a 4-year period, I could see how we lost around a fifth of our market share, while Echo Park increased their market share over that same time period by nearly fivefold, and CarMax increased their market share by about 75%. Most of the dealers to gain market share here in Colorado were corporate dealership chains. Now, while we may struggle with them as competition, we would be fools not to pay attention to what is driving their success. There is a lot that the independent used car dealers can learn from their corporate competition. And I follow quite a few publicly traded companies in the automotive space, but there are two in particular that I pay the closest attention to. That is CarMax and Sonic Automotive, which owns the Echo Park chain of used car dealerships. Let's talk about CarMax first. Their ticker symbol is KMX, and they operate more than 250 stores across the US. They are typically really large stores too. And most of you probably know their history, but for those of you who don't, they were started by Circuit City in the early 90s and eventually spun off. Circuit City doesn't exist anymore. And while at one point they owned some new car franchisees, they are now exclusively in the used car space. They also have CarMax Auto Finance, which itself has turned into a major player in the automotive finance space. Sonic, now the owners of Echo Park, ticker symbol SAH, operates over 100 dealerships, and while it spans both new and used cars, they report their Echo Park numbers separately in their earnings releases. My biggest advice is to pay attention to them. Pay attention to CarMax, Sonic, and what other corporate car dealerships you want to track, but track their stocks. Sign up for news alerts on these companies. Look at their earnings statements. Both of these companies have great investor relations sections on their websites, and there's a lot of information that you can only dream of seeing on the rest of your competition. Most importantly, the single most important economic intelligence factor, you can see their gross profit per retail unit. You can also see sales trends. And you can compare these to your own dealership's performance to give you targets and understand where your competition is at and where you should strive to be. Instead of losing to the big corporate dealerships, let's start gaining from them. And with that, it's been another episode of Down Payment, the podcast for used car dealers. Check out our podcast on all our social media channels. We are at Down Payment Podcast on YouTube, Down Payment Podcast on Instagram, and Down Payment Pod on X.
Thank you for listening. Down Payment, the podcast for used car dealers, is a production of Meta Financial Services Incorporated.